Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. The senator is right. I have very little interest in engaging on the merits of these proposals in a dialogue on the floor of the Senate because they are not serious attempts to make our kids safer. These unanimous consent requests that Senator Cruz makes, they're going to get a lot of clicks online. The confrontation that he's looking for will probably lead to a bunch of cable news appearances being booked, but it's not going to save any kids' lives. The senator knows this is not how the Senate works. This isn't an autocracy. It's not a dictatorship. You don't come down here and introduce a piece of legislation and 2 minutes later demand that the entirety of the Senate agree to it without any debate, any negotiation. The senator says these are the same bills he introduced last year. But as far as I can tell, he introduced the bills he's making unanimous consent requests on minutes ago. They're not even fully formed pieces of legislation. This thing is so ham-handed, one of the bills, that there's literally brackets and question marks in the text. The legislative drafters, at least in the version that I see, haven't made decisions on when the money is being spent. The senator says that there's this pattern that plays out after these shootings in which Democrats make demands about taking people's guns away, but aren't serious about making our kids safer. Is that how it played out after the shooting in Uvalde? Is that what happened last summer? No, that's not what happened. What happened last summer after the shooting in the senator's state is that serious members of this body who are more interested in legislating than enacting political theater, sat down together and negotiated a bill to save children's lives. Did it solve all of the problems in this country? Did it guarantee every child's safety? No, it did not. But let's be clear. Senator Cruz never expressed one iota of interest in being part of those negotiations. Other Republican senators did. And while I understand he objects to the gun provisions in that bill, guess what? That bill also put $15 billion into school safety, into mental health, into hardening our schools, into community anti-gun violence programs. I can't speak about the other members of the group that authored that bill, but I never got a single phone call from Senator Cruz during the month of negotiations suggesting that we add the language he's talking about to that proposal. Last summer, there were serious legislators who come to this floor to enact legislation to set aside our differences and pass legislation that makes our kids safe, willing to make compromise. Senator Cruz didn't even sniff that room. He references the unanimous consent request he made later last year that I objected to. I think I suggested then, as I suggest now, that the result of that unanimous consent request was to create political theater and book cable news hits. The result was not going to be a piece of legislation being enacted. And I figured that if I was wrong about that, if the senator's purpose was to pass a piece of legislation, that the result of my objection would have been to get outreach from the senator's office, to try to figure out a way forward, to try to find a compromise. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. But not once did Senator Cruz reach out and say, let's work together to get this done, which confirmed my suspicions that these unanimous consent requests are not about passing legislation. They're just about creating conflict for the sake of conflict. This legislation was introduced minutes ago, so I'm not able to debate the merits of it on the floor of the Senate right now. It appears to make a whole bunch of changes to the not-for-profit security grant program that the presiding officer knows very well, changes that have little to do with school safety. It seems that there's a bunch of processes changes to the not-for-profit security grant program. That's probably something worth having a conversation with the chairman of the committee about before we pass it by unanimous consent. It makes broad structural changes to Title IV, which is a very important program to schools. They use that money for school security, but they also use that money for a host of other important programs. That's probably worth having a conversation with the members of the Education Committee about. A very quick look at this bill suggests that it likely opens up the use of those funds to arming teachers in our school. I think that's a terrible idea. This is all to say that this isn't how the process works. You don't drop a piece of legislation on the floor of the Senate and 2 minutes later demand that the whole Senate pass it. You do that if your intent is to create conflict for the purposes of publicity. I don't know what the senator's intentions are, but if that was your intention, this is what you would do. If you were interested in actually passing something, you would have dialed up the authors of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and asked to be part of that negotiation. You'd have reached out to my office after the objection last year and said, what's your objections? Let's sit down and do something together. That's how legislation gets passed in this place. I know because I've done it on this topic. And I'm not saying that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act solved the problem. I know we have more work to do. I know it because I spend time with those same families every single week. I know it because I live in a dangerous neighborhood in South Hartford. I talk to those kids who have to fear for their life when they go to school. And that's why my purpose for being in the Senate is to work like hell across the aisle through compromise, not by coming down here, dropping a bill on the floor, and then immediately demanding that the entire Senate vote for it. That's not how we save kids' lives. Compromising, working towards compromise, behind the scenes, not always in front of the cameras. I object.